Leader.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that at this rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to a date to be fixed.
The question is that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to a date to be fixed. As many as are of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn. Your last speech, Mr. Kok Heng Loon.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I think before I speak, I would like to say this on behalf of all my NMP colleagues. We were talking about it. That we would like to also express our thanks to the House, to the government and all the fellow parliamentarians for your patience, for your generosity. Through all these debates, I think we have actually felt it was very enriching experience. Thank you very much. Yeah, and now I can do my speech. Okay.
30 seconds have gone.
Really? Okay.
Set again.
Okay. Art is art. We are familiar with art when it is art. We understand them sometimes as something material, like a painting, a sculpture, and an installation, or an event over a specific time, like a performance or movie screening. We are familiar with this art being produced and presented in conventional spaces, such as theatre, gallery spaces, cinemas, screening rooms, studios, etc. Of course, there are occasions when this work are presented in alternative spaces. But there are also defined spaces, like in a church, in a quarry, or in a cemetery. Purpose-built art spaces are crucial, like Esplanade, National Gallery Singapore, Singapore Arts Museum, the Substation, Centre 42, amongst others. These are privately managed public spaces, providing focused spaces for developing and appreciating artistic expression. They congregate audiences and supporters of the arts, therefore creating also a sense of community. They have also become iconic sites and attractions in their own right, not only for locals, but also for visitors from the region and abroad who are interested in finding out what our artistic community is doing. But art is not just what occurs in these spaces. Human capacity for expression is not limited to just these spaces. Art is not just artifice, which it can also be. It is also about life. When artists take art beyond conventional spaces, they seek to engage with the expression of the everyday and insights of the everyday. Here, the gesture and relationships of our everyday spaces and activities become the material of art. Art as life helps us to understand ourselves, allow us to reinvent ourselves. When art happens in everyday spaces, the space and the gesture, the expression, all becomes a curious. This distancing, what we call as an aesthetic distancing, stimulates queries, investigation, reflections, and in many occasions, even actions to realize the reinvention. Such art practice interrogates our everyday being. It comes with some inconvenience, but necessary to stimulate our creative and imaginative being. As I've said before, creativity comes from ruptures, from interventions, from challenging norms, perceived notions, and habits. And when such art practices happen in everyday spaces, it becomes all the more immediate. Because everyday places are public space that allow people to interact and be in communal with one another. As a small nation city, with quite a substantial population, we have a lot of built-up areas, flats, huge shopping centers, office buildings, and with so much focus on economic and consumeristic activities and successes, public spaces for everyday interaction and communal engagement is important. As Peter Rowe, a professor at Harvard University graduate of School of Design, said, "A sense of community makes me feel as though I'm part of a human race, not the rat race." When familiar everyday place is filled with excitement and surprises, one becomes rejuvenated and excited. One becomes attentive to things around us, not taking them as for granted. Hence, arts as life in everyday places is one important way to reconnect to our spontaneity, to rediscover our curiosity, to repair our relationships with place, things, and people. And now I will talk about the permits and permission related to the using of this space. But first, let me recall my early years working as an administrator at a substation founded by Mr. Kuo Pao Kun. By the way, today is the 16th death anniversary of Mr. Kuo. The substation is also called the home for the arts. And indeed, it is a home for many artists and many different art practices. There was this sense of free spirit where conversations flows and things happen. It's a place that celebrates spontaneity, respects artists and their work. It also respects audience by honoring them as individuals who are generous even when they may have different tastes and preferences on art. I would like to focus on the substation garden, which is an outdoor space of the substation where public would come, artists would gather. Hence, it is a public space. On a busy night, there would be set up in the garden to prep for a performance or a hard rock gig with very noisy sound tests. There will be people after watching a piece of theatre at the black box. They would be gathering at the garden, discussing what they saw, debating what they liked or disliked, expressing their frustration over some impenetrable work. In the same garden, artists like Zai Kuning, Tang Dao, Amanda Heng, or academics like Lai Ying would be at the garden, probably talking to each other after a conference. While some people may be practicing on their guitars, or Basker Roy Payamel would be practicing his juggling skill in the garden. Street performing artist Roy did not need to seek for permission to practice at the garden. Roy made sure that whenever his juggling ball flew out of his hand, crossing the path of anyone there, he would pick it up. In his very gently manner, he would smile apologetically. Why did I take such pain to describe the substation garden? Because it was here that I learned about what makes a space a place and what makes a good public space. Here I learned to debate, to listen, to know that there are so many art forms, so many possible artistic practices, so many different opinions that it is important not to judge, but to know that we are all different. We have different opinions and we can coexist. The garden was a place that needed no permissions. In fact, many years later, I realized that the people who used the garden, whether the artists or the audience, gave permission to each other to try things, to be different, to disagree, to agree, and most importantly, to gather. That is why it became such an amazing public space for artists and audience. And I don't remember me, being an art administrator then, managing the garden, have to do any policing. So now on the point of permits and permission, within conventional spaces, certain conditions of the space and use may already determine how art is developed or presented. But yet it is, I have to say that it is to the credit of some of these arts public institutions like Esplanade National Gallery who have gone the extra mile to reach out to audience, to make these public spaces. However, would this huge public institution where artists gather, where artists would meet and talk about ideas, allow people to be spontaneous? What if when dancers, while discussing their future work at the foyer, starts to move to demonstrate ideas, then followed by some improvisations that come along in response to the movements? Would this be allowed in such institutions? I've checked with some of the artists, and this is our stories where they told me that they will be stopped by the security guards. And the reason cited would be such activities or behavior would create disturbances to other visitors. Have we become overzealous in our effort to make sure that these public spaces are well kept, thereby taking away the spirit of spontaneity of an artistic space? That's an irony indeed. So how can this privately owned public institution allow such spontaneity? Then what about the use of everyday spaces for the arts? There are permits and laws that prohibit certain kinds of activities or expression, such as Public Order Act, Public Disturbance, Obscenity Act, etc. These laws do articulate to an to an extent and to a measure of certainty and interpretation, the scope of what is legal or permitted by authorities. But let us consider a hypothetical situation. On a weekday night, a musician outside Toa Payoh Library, there's a big square there, practicing his guitar. Well, his skill was so good that he attracted people gathering around him. He responded because it was fun, and he asked them to start to move and dance. So people gather. So is this permissible? People may say that this is a hypothetical situation and Singaporeans are not so spontaneous. I disagree and agree. I disagree because after many years of artistic practices in public space, I find that Singaporeans want to tell their stories. They want to express, to connect with artists. That desire is innate, deeply human. To be with each other, to do things spontaneously. In the early years of our foreign theatre performances, we have to beg people to come up to make interventions, or to expect our friends to come up to make interventions. But now, people, audiences come up voluntarily. When we set up tables for conversations on end-of-life issues, people will sit and share and will not stop until we tell them that we have to end by 10 p.m. because that's stipulated in our performance license. Yet, I also would agree that Singaporeans are not so spontaneous because I think we have been culturally and politically conditioned to be cautious. The many laws like Public Order Acts that caution people from getting together for a cause, permits and permission needed to express, to perform, all these narratives of Singapore need to be orderly has conditioned our mindset, inhibiting us, making us fearful of being spontaneous. What if I break the law? What if people get offended? What if people complain? And many, many what ifs. Deputy Speaker, there are a lot of instances where art works well in public and everyday spaces. Foreign theatre in heartlands dealing with difficult issues like end-of-life concerns, discriminations of migrant workers, domestic violence, all this has happened in public spaces without incidents. In one of our recent work, The Lesson, which talk about how one makes difficult choices on land issues and what is a democratic process, people stayed to participate, debate, and are respectful of each other. Crowd events such as Night Fest, etc., when there certainly isn't a high ratio of security for the crowd it attracts, goes on peacefully. I would say that the populace knows how to experience and understand arts in these places. Can art happen beyond the 30 prescribed places by the government? Only when art can happen in ordinary and everyday spaces, then can we claim, as in the ACSR report, that art is everywhere. Then there's still the question of what kind of work is permitted, and who can decide them. In the case of artistic expression, is it aesthetic, which can be subjective, moral, which has a level of subjectivity too, and which has certain aspects covered under legal terms, or political, which should be distinguished from legal? What are all these considerations that help decide if that work can be done in public or in everyday spaces? What if there were a case when an artistic expression does not flout the law? Should or then, can it be permissible by default? Or if a permission was sought for such an artistic expression that does not flout the law, would it be granted? If a group had applied for a license to blindfold themselves and sit in the train silently, holding the book, this is what inequality looks like, would that be permitted? Would it also be allowed if it is done without applying for permit and license? It is a quiet piece. It does not create any disturbances. It is a performance art in the public. What if there are some complaints from certain members of the public to the work? Does it then mean that it should be taken down or the performance being stopped? Can an individual or a group who disagree with a particular artistic work or message then advocate for it to be removed in the name of it being in the public space? So who is this public? What is this public space for? For which public? The right to the city. This is an idea proposed by by a French sociologist who talks about if a city which also include the public space, is meant for public. It should be safe and permissible for everyone to be there to interact, to exchange information and ideas, as long as the exchange does not incinerate and create disorder. That is a right to the city, a right for everyone. So, what should we do if there are complaints about artistic work being placed in public space? Let me quote from ACSR, page 18. I quote, "There is a scope to let the community take greater ownership of our arts and cultural activities, facilities and development in order to harness Singapore's creative capacity. Unfortunately, much of our cultural development is currently perceived as being directed top-down. Our people need more space and support to initiate artistic and cultural activities from the ground up, with the government playing a more catalytic role in facilitating connections and allowing emergent subcultures and creative communities to thrive." I support the government in this vision, but we know that while we are at the infancy of this development, there have been disputes and disagreement. The Golden Staircase, Mr. Oh's installation at the Void Deck in Chong Pang, amongst others. So here I would humbly like to propose that the government should form an independent body, almost like an ombudsman, to look at such disagreement. The independent body should include legal experts, artistic personnel, or various stakeholders to address this disagreement, to investigate complaints, but importantly, to set up dialogues and conversations between complainants and artists. This is how public space should be managed. It is about dialogues, sometimes with disagreement, but the intention is to include, not to exclude. So I would like to end my speech on this issue of trust. I hope that this government would trust that artists in Singapore are very, very responsible people. And a lot of time when they make work, they work that are personal, with a lot of committed beliefs. When we talk about earning trust, one is not just about sitting there and say, "Hey, show me you can be trusted." It means one needs to reach out, to connect in order to express trust. The public space, being a space where strangers meet strangers, means we have to be able to trust by connecting and not by segregating or being territorial or tribal. Any honest and truthful artists work on trust. Why? Because without which they would not put their artwork in the public, to be critiqued, to be judged. And artwork is a personal and deep expression of self, and to show it to public, one must trust the audience. It is this gesture of faith in our capacity as artists, as human beings, that we want to reach out to people and to hear and get their response. Artists have great faith in audiences. Likewise, I hope the audience, the public, the government, everyone would have the same faith in audience, in the artists. Art practices in everyday spaces is an expression of this trust and this connection. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kok. I'm glad I did not have to guillotine you. MCC1 Minister.
Thank you.
Grace Hu.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank Mr. Kok for his observations and suggestions to increase artistic expression and engagement in Singapore. Mr. Kok referred to the many opportunities for art in public spaces beyond the conventional gallery, theatre or studio. In fact, he has mentioned several examples of how foreign theatre has been able to engage the public in multi-heritage board has done well to balance accessibility and security. I agree with Mr. Kok that Singapore's arts and culture scene, including art in our public spaces, is indeed vibrant and thriving. Aside from the Nights Festival, there are many other opportunities for Singaporeans to enjoy art in everyday spaces in the city centre as well as in our heartlands. These include NHB's Singapore Heritage Festival, National Gallery's Light Tonight, the National Art Council's Arts in Your Neighbourhood, and People's Association's Passion Arts. I'm sure passion art is quite familiar to many of us sitting around in this house. because it is taking place in every constituency in Singapore, really available for public art. The government has embarked on a variety of efforts to increase public art over the last 30 years. These include the Urban Development Authority's Public Sculpture Master Plan and Art Incentive Scheme, the Land Transport Authority's Art in Transit Program, NHB's Public Art Tax Incentive Scheme, and the NAC's establishment of the Public Art Trusts in 2014 with a $10 million seed fund from the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. And under NAC's busking scheme, over 250 buskers have been endorsed since 2017. They include the father and son duo, Mr. Masruddin Saharuddin and Nizaruddin, who were featured at this year's National Day Parade, and whose performances have enlivened city life and energized urban spaces. I'm pleased to update that NAC has secured over 50. MCCY remains committed to making the arts and culture accessible to everyone and to working closely in partnership with art practitioners as well as enthusiasts, hobbyists and volunteers. We want to create an environment where more Singaporeans and not only trained artists can appreciate and participate in the arts, so that the arts are an integral part of our lives. 2017, Passion Arts involved some 50,000 art participants and volunteers, about 30 art groups and 300 organizations including schools, volunteer welfare organizations, religious groups, community groups and hospitals in more than 65 heartland locations. At this year's Passion Arts Festival, patrons and supporters of the arts. To do this, we provide opportunities for talented youth to showcase their work. At the recent Night Festival, I had the pleasure of interacting with two groups involving students from the Singapore University of Technology and Design and their work. Hyperbrands by Kopi O and Orbits by Lightworks. Their enthusiasm demonstrated how we must continue to support our youth in pursuing their passions, including by expressing themselves and showcasing a part of our Singaporean identity through the arts. The government supports art in everyday spaces because we are aware of its ability to shape common experiences and to spark shared interests. And if done well, this can help Singapore to ensure that we promote the arts and raise arts excellence in a way that gains strong public support for arts and culture across the board. And therefore, in promoting public art, we must strike a careful balance between the artists and the stakeholders who own and use the premises. For example, park users may appreciate the occasional band performance, but prefer to keep the park quiet and serene at other times. And therein lies the need to consult different stakeholders as a matter of respect and basic courtesy. Those who own and use the space should also have a say. And I'm sure that Mr. Kok can see the merits of this approach, as he has often advocated for acknowledging diversity in views, in this case from different users of public spaces, including non-art practitioners. He commissions key public artworks. The first 3 commissions under the Public Art Trust were conceived to commemorate Singapore's Golden Jubilee. Another 2 new public artworks will be commissioned in community spaces to commemorate Singapore's bicentennial next year. And NAC plans to commission 1 additional public artwork each year thereafter. In other words, we are actively supporting, financing, cultivating artists to bring public art, sculpture, installation art in our public spaces. NAC has made efforts to involve the arts communities in good public art projects through its grants. For example, Open House, a recipient of NAC's major company scheme funding, curates art walks that bring art into unexpected, everyday spaces such as HDB flats. Second, just for this art. For example, the PAT advises both site owners and artists on best practices in commissioning, installing, maintaining and decommissioning public artworks. Third, to present public art that is relevant to Singaporeans from all communities and walks of life. We must continue to bring art closer to the community through thoughtful programming and outreach. The initiatives of our art groups like the National Orchestras and Mr. Kok's own drama box in the heartlands are good examples. The PAT commissioned a Stop and Smell the Ang Mo Tan exhibition with NAC's Arts in Your Neighbourhood initiative in March this year. The site-specific works by 4 Singaporean artists included talks, live painting sessions, and hands-on craft activities for residents and non-resident and people sectors. Today, a wide range and diversity of visual and performing arts have enlivened our public spaces. The government will continue to develop our policies so that Singapore is home to diverse and distinctive arts that are accessible to and inspire our people and connect our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the indulgence.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn. As many as are of their opinion say aye. To the contrary say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.